when we started the 7th chapter of the Mishnah of Shabbat, we began with a principle just about obligations to bring a sin offering, depending on what kind of circumstances we might, in what kind of circumstances we might forget Shabbat. And that Mishnah introduced the idea that there are certain primary labors or primary acts of creation that we refrain from on Shabbat. And the Mishnah taught that if we know it's Shabbat and we perform many of these acts on many Shabbatot, we bring a chatat, bring a sin offering for each primary labor. And this Mishnah, which introduces the idea of these primary acts of creation, of course, leads to another Mishnah, which enumerates, which lists what these acts of creation are, and there are 39 of them. Now, these 39 acts of creation are connected with the building of the tabernacle. The Talmud learns this out just from the verses, and there are many, many places, by the way, both in Kitisa, around Kitisa, particularly where the parallels between building the tabernacle and keeping Shabbat are outlined. I just brought you a couple of pasukim from the beginning of Vayakel, because that is where the narrative of constructing the tabernacle begins. And it's very interesting. Vayakel Moshe gathers all the congregation together, and he's going to tell them to begin. He's going to tell them to build a tabernacle, but he begins by saying, 6 days, on 6 days work shall be done. Uvayom hashvi yelachem Kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton Lashem. The 7th day is holy. And then he goes on to enumerate the commandment to build the tabernacle. But he begins by enumerating the commandment to keep Shabbat. And he mentions not only that we keep Shabbat, but that we don't light a fire on Shabbat throughout our habitations. So the Mishnah, we're now in the second Mishnah of the 7th chapter of Shabbat. The Mishnah will then go and enumerate the 39 labors, or as the Mishnah puts it, 40 less 1. That's a reference, by the way, to Makot. When if someone is subjected to lashes, they're subjected to 40 lashes according to the biblical text, but we give 40 less 1. And in the same way, we express this number 39, the number of primary archetypal labors, as 40 less 1. And so the Mishnah begins, Avot Melacha Arba'im Chaser Echad. The primary labors, the archetypal acts of creation, are 40 less 1. And you'll see that they're laid out in some kind of sequence of activity that corresponds broadly to the sort of sequences of activity that we might carry out in daily life. So Hazorea vechoresh vehakotzer vehamamer hadash vehazore vehapore vehatochen vehamarked vehalash vehaofe. Sowing and plowing and reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, and baking. So you can see we're going here, that we're developing here the whole process of baking a loaf from the point of sowing the seed right the way through to baking it in the oven. And it's the same, by the way, with construction and materials. So, hagozezet hadsemer, halmulbano, shearing wool, bleaching it, hackling it, dyeing it, spinning it, weaving it, making loops to connect it together, weaving 2 threads together, separating it out 2 threads, tying and untying, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches. Again, we are going through here the whole process of building up a cloth garment from the very, very beginning of shearing the sheep right the way through to sewing it or taking it apart in order to sew it better. And then, having outlined what we need to do to make food what we need to do to make clothes. And maybe this is connected to the tabernacle, but also you can see this is connected in some way to basic human needs. And this is how the Mishnah seems to be laying out these 39 cardinal acts. Now we're going to go on to writing. If we can eat and if we can clothe ourselves, the next question is, can we write? And of course, writing begins with hunting. Hatzad tzvi, ve'ashochto, ve'hamashito, ve'hamolcho, ve'hamaberet oro, ve'hamorko, ve'hamachatcho, hakotev shtei otiyot, ve'hamochek al menat lichtov shtei otiyot. We're going to hunt a deer. We're going to slaughter it. We're going to flay it. We're going to salt it. We're going to cure its hide. And then we scrape it and we cut it up. And at this point, we have something we can write on. So we're going to write 2 letters, or we might erase in order to write 2 letters. I mentioned, by the way, yesterday, I thought that erasing was not a primary act. I thought it was a secondary act derived from writing, but it is actually a primary act all on its own. Writing 2 letters, somehow writing 1 letter is not sufficient to be a creative act, but writing 2 letters is. And the Gemara derives this actually from marks that were put on the slats that surrounded the tabernacle, and they'd put 1 mark on each slat in order to connect one slat to the other. Once you've got 2 marks, you can essentially lay out the order of the slats. So we eat, we dress ourselves, and then we write. So writing is somehow a fundamental activity. And then we have some other activities which are connected to construction: building, tearing down, extinguishing, lighting. Interesting that extinguishing is before lighting, as if perhaps extinguishing here refers to extinguishing in order to light, just as rubbing out refers to rubbing out in order to write. Extinguishing refers to extinguishing in order to light, perhaps, just as erasing refers to erasing in order to write. Striking with a hammer, hamakeba patish. And this doesn't refer mechanically to striking with a hammer, or perhaps at one point back in the early times of the Mishnah it did, but striking with a hammer in the world of the Gemara is to do with finishing something off. When a workman essentially finishes his work, he just gives a tap with a hammer to say, almost as if to say, that is the finishing touch. It's a particular activity all on its own. And just as hamakeba patish, striking with a hammer, is a particular activity all on its own, so is the last one in the list, which is the first one mentioned in the Mishnah of Shabbat. So we're going back right to the beginning of the tractate now. The last one in the list is the first one mentioned, and the first one which we delve into in detail in the Mishnah of Shabbat. Hamotzi mereshut lireshut, someone who carries from one domain to the other, say from the private to the public. The householder standing inside his doorway, the poor man outside, one of them reaches in or one of them reaches out with an object. That's the first archetypal act which the Mishnah describes. And interestingly, it's the last one in this list. And then the Mishnah concludes as it began, these are the 40 primary labors less one. I'm intrigued by the fact that this Mishnah, which is really the core of the whole of the tractate of Shabbat, does not appear at the beginning of the tractate. And we remember we began with examples of carrying. We did not begin by laying out this overall structure. And it's really not quite clear to me why this appears now, but I might point out to you that we have here a string of 3 Mishnayot which lay out general principles. We've had the Mishnah we learned yesterday, which was the principle of how we enumerate the sin offerings that are required if we forget this Shabbat. We have the principle of the 39 labors. And then there's one more principle coming up, which is in the next Mishnah, which goes back to the principle of carrying. And once we've laid out these three principles, we then go back into a more extended discussion about other kinds of carrying. So perhaps these three sets of principles which seem to fit together, maybe they're just connected to the fact that in this early part of the tractate, we are really exploring the question of carrying. And the next Mishnah, we're only going to look at 2 Mishnayot today. We can't deal with 3 Mishnayot. The next Mishnah is the principle of what is a meaningful quantity of stuff or of something to be carried. So we learned that we don't carry from the private to the public domain on Shabbat or vice versa. But what is carry? And we've learned about the kinds of objects which can and cannot be carried. So clothing can be, clothing is not an issue, but a load is an issue. But we haven't learned about quantity. How much do we need to carry in order to transgress the prohibition on carrying on Shabbat? And this is the third principle which the Mishnah is going to enumerate. The od klal acher amru, and one more principle, they said, the sages said, kol hakasher lahatzniya umatznim kamohu v'hotzio b'Shabbat chayav alav chatat. Something which is worthy to be stored, something which is worth storing. And people generally store things like it. So it's not just that I think it's worth storing and you think it's worth storing, but people store it. If someone carries it out on Shabbat, they're liable to a sin offering. So maybe, a loaf of bread. You keep a loaf of bread and we don't carry it out on Shabbat. But the Mishnah says, the Mishnah then goes on to say, V'chol she'eino kasher lahatzniya, anything which is not worth storing. V'ein matzni'in kamohu, and we don't store it. So going back to the analogy of the loaf of bread, let's talk about crumbs. We don't store crumbs. It's not worth storing a few crumbs. Something which is not stored and not fit to be stored, eino chayav ela hamatznio. Someone who carries it out on Shabbat isn't liable to a sin offering, with one exception, with the exception of someone who does store it. So if you were someone who had an amazing crumb collection, for some reason crumbs are important to you. Crumbs are something that you store. Maybe the rest of the population doesn't store, but you store them on Shabbat. Then for you to carry them out on Shabbat would require, if you forgot it was Shabbat and you carried them out, you'd be required to bring a sin offering. And someone else, by the way, who carried out the same crumbs would not be liable. In other words, the only person, in the case of something which is not generally stored, the only person who's liable is the person who does somehow like storing it. So it's a situation-dependent halacha. This is the principle. And then in the next few Mishnayot, which last for a couple of chapters actually, we're then going to look at specific examples of quantities of specific objects, and we're going to see whether they are what makes a material quantity, a critical mass quantity, to be worth carrying out on Shabbat.